Good evening, everyone. You should see a little poll launch, very brief, if you could fill that out. I'm going to wait like a minute for people to trickle in and we'll get going here. All right, we're going to kind of slowly get the ball rolling here. For those of you who've just joined, there should be a little poll that you'll see pop up. You just fill that out. Um, and as we go today, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A and I will get to them at the end. My name is Tal Kitron with Alperuth Tutoring. I'm a tutor doing mostly SAT, ACT, and PSAT, and executive function coach as well. I've been with the company for over 10 years, seen a bunch of different changes of iterations of the SAT and PSAT and now ACT. And today we're just going to talk a little bit about the content, the format, some strategies, and then I do want to also make you guys aware of the changes that are coming to the ACT. Do understand, though, that the ACT currently is on paper for almost everyone in the US. So unless you've heard otherwise, if you're taking an official ACT, it would be a paper test. And we're going to talk through the format of what that looks like. Just know that the whole format is changing later this year. But we do have the April, June, and July ACTs that will be in the format that we're going to discuss today. So first, scoring. Unlike the SAT, which is another standardized test, college entrance exam, just like the ACT, the SAT is out of 1600, but a perfect ACT score is a 36. The lowest you can get is an 8. You get a 2 just for showing up on each section. And the way they calculate this composite score, this overall ACT score, is they add up your English, math, reading, and science that are all scored out of 36, and then they average them. If you divide it and you get like a 32.5, that rounds up to a 33, whereas a 32.25 would round down. And the way the test looks is always like this. It's very fast paced. First is the English section. So you'll always say English first. And we'll look at what that entails and what's on it, what types of questions and strategies. But 75 questions in 45 minutes, I mean, that's just a lot. Math is probably the first section that people really struggle for time on, though. English less so. 60 minutes for 60 questions. They get harder as they go. Then a 10-minute break, and then 2 breakneck speed sections. Reading, which is 35 minutes for 40 questions, and then science, which is the same timing, 35 minutes, 40 questions. So total, not including the break, is 3 hours and 5 minutes, which is about an hour longer than the current digital SAT. So part of the reason the ACT will be changing soon is to make it shorter. Right now, it's kind of a long test. There's not that much time per question, and there are a lot of questions. So English, math, reading, science. And within that, what they actually test is what you would expect. So 80% overlap between ACT and SAT. You're going to see grammar, so verb tense and subject verb and punctuation and clauses and all that. Of course, you get tested on math from arithmetic to algebra to geometry. But I always tell people that SAT wants you to know a lot about a little on math. The ACT would like you to know a little bit about a lot. So anything from a matrix to a logarithm to percents to ratios to just a word problem about prime numbers. They just want you to have a broad base of knowledge. And if you see something and you're like, oh, I remember it, you're probably golden. And if you don't, you may be in trouble. They test reading comprehension, of course, really throughout, because there's a lot of wordy problems on all sections. And then vocab, graph reading, and interpreting data. These are all things really that are tested on the SAT as well. So before we launch into each individual section, let's talk overall strategy. You have to practice pacing. You don't want to go into an ACT for the very first time and just take it blindly, because you'll run out of time and you'll be surprised by certain things. This is a test of effort. Your job is to get to know the test and the test writers and how they operate. Rule number one, always circle what you're solving for. Answer what the question is really asking. Don't let your brain run wild. So a lot of my brightest students work too hard. On ACT, it's always simple. There's almost always an easy solution method. And then there are no points off for wrong answers, so don't leave anything blank, but do strategically skip around. So you don't have to go in order 1 through 60, but rather you'd actually probably be better off doing like the first 30 questions and then maybe jumping around, get all the easy points. If you do run out of time, we always want it to be on the hardest material, toughest question. All right, let's talk English. Traditionally, for most people, the easiest section, the easiest to improve as well. We said 75 questions, so 5 passages at 15 questions apiece, and you get 9 minutes per passage. So 9 minutes for 15 questions. That averages to 36 seconds per question, but not all questions are created equal. Some rhetoric questions where it's about flow and staying on topic, those might take a minute or two, whereas certain grammar questions will take you 5 seconds. So one thing we have to do is differentiate between grammar and rhetoric. And when you're in the English section, you'll see passage on the left, which you don't really have to read. So that's strategy number one. On English, not on reading, but on English section 1, don't look at the passage, look at the questions and answers. The answers tell you everything if it's a grammar question. So like right here, if I see glide versus glides, not only are they verbs, but those are singular versus plural. They're both present tense verbs. That to me means a bunch. And so this is because I've been teaching and taking the SAT and ACT for years, but I know that just having those two answers present means this is not a verb tense question. It's subject verb agreement. One of these is right, first off, so almost always. You see the singular versus the plural dichotomy in the answer choices. And probably the subject's way before the verb, or maybe something weird here, like the verb before the subject. And that's what's happening, is they're trying to make you think mountaintops glide, but that's not what is gliding, it's the eagle. So in this case, we could notice glide versus glides, realize the subject's the eagle, and pick C, it glides. Subject verb is a really important question type because if you identify what it is, it tends to be like the easiest question in the world, right? You can kind of run down those 3 things. That's the clues that these test writers are giving us. Here are a few examples that I'm just going to leave up for a moment for people to try. So 3 classic punctuation or clauses, ACT English examples. So remember, process is look at the answer choices first. No change will be correct 1 out of 4 times, so don't avoid it. It's correct just as often as the others. And on these questions, like for numbers 1 and 3 in particular, there's a definite strategy. You want to test semicolons and periods first. Semicolons separate 2 full sentences, just like periods do. So they're very easy to test, right? I can look at number 1 and say, divers off the coast of Japan discover surprise on the seafloor. Well, that's a full sentence. But then circular patterns made of sand is not. So A could not work, but I'd be able to rule it out confidently. Then I test D. The rule for a colon is a colon must follow an independent clause, so it must come after a full sentence. Check, we have that. And it's a drum roll, please. It must introduce what comes after. In 1995, divers off the coast of Japan discovered a surprise on the seafloor. Drum roll, please, what was it? Circular patterns made of sand. Number two is testing commas, but also some conjugation of verbs. So if you look closely, it says these circles were often over 7 feet diameter and contained. That sounds good, whereas C and D sound not good. You wouldn't say were over 7 feet and containing, or were and contains. That's mixed up verb tense. So then we test B, which has no commas. They were often over 7 feet in diameter and contained concentric rings and ridges, making them appear much like a target or landing pad. Wasn't terrible, but if we read the pause and it sounds okay, we have to pick the comma. A is the right answer here because it separates ideas. They were big, they contain concentric rings and ridges, comma, making them appear much like a target or landing pad. And then three is beautiful. B and D are wrong because they're functionally identical. Semicolons are periods on this test with pretty much no exceptions. So B and D, they're both wrong. They can't both be right. They're both wrong. And then here we look for dash or comma, and comma is more appropriate. That's mostly just a trusting your ear question. But this is very typical. And some of the hardest questions will be just about punctuation and independent versus dependent clauses. The other grammar topics you can expect, there aren't that many. Verb tense, subject-verb agreement, which we saw, pronouns, so knowing like I versus me, which most people are not very great at, and who versus whom, possession, which includes its and it apostrophe s, misplaced modifier, so that's about placing a subject either at the beginning or end where it needs to be. Connectors comes up a lot, so that's however versus therefore, etc. And then probably the number one, like most common question type would be brevity or redundancy, meaning if you are in doubt on ACT grammar, this is the most important thing you can take away. When in doubt, cut it out. We like short answers. So for grammar, if it's no change and 3 choices, shorter is better. If you're down to 2 choices, pick the shorter one always. ACT English, short answer is good. With the exception being these questions. So the only other thing we got to look at on English is what we call rhetorical skills. We'll look at the various types, but the key for all of these is there will be an actual question. It won't just be a no change grammar stuff. So it won't just be like there's an underlined portion that we're changing. It's, oh, we've got a job to do. When that happens, become a robot. We just need to say like here, should the writer make this addition? Let's say yes or no. And we'll do that based on if it's on topic, we'll say yes, as long as it also flows. If it stays on topic and it flows, that's a yes, we like it. And usually if it's not good, it's pretty terrible. You look at it and say, man, that's no good. Clearly we can't do this question because we don't have the passage. So that's the key is grammar, we don't really need context. But for these rhetoric questions, which make up 40, 50% of English, we do. So here's an example that we can try. Should go straight to the question itself. And what we would see is on the real test, passage on the left with this part underlined, and on the right, this is a rhetoric question because we've got a job to do. There's a question being asked. At the underlined point, the writer would like to provide specific information about her brother's hobbies. That is our job. So then these become the easiest questions in the world. You just go down the list. I mean, A says maybe hobbies, but like not specific. B is perfect. I mean, B is definitely our answer. Oops. Because it says Legos, it says Lincoln Log masterpieces, those are specific examples of hobbies. C is not bad, but it's not specific enough. And then same with D, which games. So you can become, again, a robot, just match, and it's all about staying on topic and keeping the flow. Again, if it's decent, just be objective and say, sure, I'll add it. You'll know if it's bad. It'll be terrible. Try not to bring your own skills as a writer or reader in. Be objective, not subjective. And remember that you're basically going to say like, yes, I'll add it unless it's pretty horrible, right? You'll know if it's bad. The skills you'll be tested on would be order and placement. That's the toughest, I think, where you got to move a sentence around to match it, with the context. Sometimes they ask you, the writer's goal was to accomplish this. Did they do it? Yes or no? And for that, you'd have to run back because we didn't really read the passage. We'd have to go look at the title and work a little harder. Add and delete information. So like the writer wants to add this here. Should they do it? Yes or no? And then accomplish a task where we saw with this hobbies, we've got some sort of job to do. Our then goal is robotically eliminate answers that don't stay on topic or don't flow. That should leave you at the correct answer more often than not. So final English tips, differentiate between grammar and rhetoric. For grammar, where they've got the no change and just little answers with different grammar rules, we like short answers and trust your ear. Whereas for rhetoric, we're robots. We don't care about short answers anymore. Totally different. It's all about how does it flow? Does it stay on topic? And you should treasure every question and answer choice as if it's worth 1 point out of 36, because on English, with the way the curve works, it probably is, right? Each question missed, even though there are 75 of them, could cost us a point because there will be a decent amount of people who get perfect or close to it, right? If they nail all the easy grammar stuff. And again, if questions come up about English, we can put them in the Q&A. I'll get to those at the end. But let's talk math. ACT section 2 goes straight from the 45-minute English section straight into math. So no break. 60 minutes for 60 questions. Grab bag of various concepts. Even here you can see a logic question, a geometry question, and an inequality question. That's kind of a typical cross section. Calculator allowed. Formulas not provided, but you do need to know quite a bit of geometry stuff, just basic geometry formulas. And notice that there are 5 multiple choice answers. This is the only section of any test, ACT or SAT, where there are 5 answers, not 4. This is the hardest section to prepare for, in my opinion, besides maybe science, simply because there's so much stuff. A lot of it's knocking off rust, but like almost a quarter of the math is geometry, which people often were taking the ACT in junior year. We took geometry in 9th grade. We've forgotten it. Arithmetic, which might have been even before that. And that's just like random stuff like percents and sequences and just things that we haven't really thought about in a while. And yes, a good chunk of algebra, but they do that with word problems. They don't hide the ball, but there are certainly concepts and topics that people have often learned and forgotten. You can expect the first 20 to be quite easy, really. 21 through 40 medium, 41 through 60 hard, with of course some overlap in each section, but they get harder as they go. So what's our strategy? Rule number 1, circle what you are solving for. Literally in the booklet, you need to be marking up the test booklet a ton. On math and reading and science, really, got to be marking up the booklet. Part of that would be translating word problems into mathematical equations, so actively reading, which we'll talk about on the reading section. And then showing your work. They should provide scratch paper, but you can also write in the test booklet. And then don't do mental math. No points awarded for mental math. Use your calculator. And just about any calculator is legal at this point. And then within reason, check your answer. So if it's a geometry question where you're solving for an angle and it's clearly, more than 90 degrees, but your answer was 40, you should check it and be like, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Of course, we have to keep moving, so there's a balance. You can't really stop and check every answer as you go through it. You kind of got to do it in the booklet, bring it over into the Scantron, bubble in, and just keep it moving. If we have time at the end to go back and check stuff, great. But honestly, that's pretty rare. Here's a couple math problems you might see like in the middle of a test. Remembering that for something like SOHCAHTOA or Pythagoras or right triangles generally, you'd have to memorize that stuff. The SAT provides those formulas and doesn't test it very often. Of course, the ACT doesn't provide them and test them quite often. But even here, you can see like a trig question where if you know SOHCAHTOA, it's easy. And then 30 is like about irrational numbers, which might be a term that people don't even remember. We're gonna go through just a couple examples so you can see like what it would look like and how to approach, and just kind of how to walk through a math problem. It's all about being methodical and careful. So here we've got a question on the left-hand side. First step is what's being asked, which is how many feet up the wall does the ladder reach? So the height of this triangle. And if it's not a special right triangle, which generally you want to look out for them, but you don't want to assume that it would be, it's probably just a regular right triangle, in which case we need the Pythagorean theorem. Most of my students remember that's a squared plus b squared is c squared, where c is the hypotenuse, the longest side. So that's set up as 24 squared plus x squared, or b squared, I guess, equals 26 squared. And then we just compute, we do the math. Right, 24 squared is 576. If you subtract that from the other side, you get that b squared is 100. And if you square root both sides, b is 10. Double check what we're solving for. Yeah, this was a 5, 12, 13 multiple, but that wouldn't have helped all that much or saved much time. So we can be pretty confident here that our answer is just 10, J. But if they'd asked us for perimeter, then we'd have another step to do, or area, and so on. And then a considerably more difficult question, this one, here's a probability question. A bag of nuts contains 9 macadamias, 13 cashews, 18 peanuts. They're asking how many additional cashews should we add to get this certain probability of 2/5. The danger here is focusing on cashews will change both the numerator and the denominator. I'll say that again. If you add, for example, like you should think about, could I add 3 cashews? That's 13 plus 3, but it's also the total number of nuts plus 3. You have to change that part, which makes it hard. So this is, I don't think, intuitive at all. But if you could focus on what isn't changing, the macadamias and the peanuts, well, if cashews end up as 2/5, those nuts have to be 3/5. And they aren't changing. We're not adding macadamias or peanuts. We are only adding cashews. There are 27 current peanuts and macadamias. So we need to figure out just 27 out of what final total would be 3/5. 27 over x equals 3 over 5. Then, like one of the chapters in the ACT guide that I work through with all my students is fractions, because people have forgotten how to deal with them. We just cross multiply. 135, so 5 times 27 equals 3x, divide by 3, we get x is 45. Now, if that was an answer, a lot of people would pick it, but it'd be wrong. Because remember, we're asked how many cashews must we add? Well, there were a total of 40 to start. Now we have 45 nuts, so it must have been 5 cashews. B is our answer. This is a much, much harder question than the previous one. Right, and you can see even the previous one was number 18, this is number 31. That's kind of how things evolve as the math section progresses. Last tips and tricks for math. So again, there's no free response, it's all multiple choice, but you got to show your work and don't do any mental math, even if it's basic subtraction or addition. Prioritize easier questions, which are usually the early ones, but could be anywhere. Like if you're taking calc and you see a question that you recognize, great. It is more than okay not to get to every question. The vast majority of students will not on math, but do not leave anything blank. My recommendation is to bubble in EK, EK, EK all the way down. That is the 5th choice. It's A, B, C, D, E. So we do a E, and then F, G, H, J, K. So if you bubble straight down the line rather than Christmas treeing it, you're likely to at least get some of them correct. And honestly, you can get a great math score bubbling in like 10, 15, 20 questions. If you nail the rest and just go EK the rest all the way down, that's the ticket to a very good math score for most. I recommend reviewing basic geometry and SOHCAHTOA, trig rules, and mean, median, mode. Always draw stuff out if they don't do it for you. And if you do get stuck, make sure you use the answers if they're friendly, or plug in your own numbers, pick numbers to make it simpler. We don't want to do abstract algebra, we want to keep it very easy. So that's math, section 2. after which you'll get a 10-minute break, and then we'll start reading. And so no break for us today because we only have, what, 30 minutes left to work with. On the reading section, section 3, a lot of times people are bringing in what happened on math. So just as a test taker, like my advice to you is try to reset in that 10 minutes. Neck rolls, right? Shoulder rolls, bring a snack, bring water, go to the restroom, like just try to stay focused, but also rest your brain a little bit and stretch your legs. The reading section is a time crunch. So the end of this test is very fast. You've got 40 questions, 35 minutes, right? And the same for science. What you see on the right side is what you'll see on test day. So long passage that you actually have to read, unlike English. I would read the passages first, and then we go to the questions. If you are a fairly quick reader or you're aiming for a very high score, you get 8 minutes and 45 seconds per passage. That's how you can get to all 4 passages and all 40 questions. However, many people can't, and just it's not realistic to try to do 4 passages in 35 minutes. And for those people, it's like, well, let's just try to get 3 passages and then we'll guess straight down the line on the last one. So then maybe you take more like 12 minutes per passage, right? And then you can actually get to it all. That's better than trying to kind of halfway do 3 passages or 4 passages. And then again, if we're like more lower scoring and we're just time is an issue and we just can't get to everything, well, then we just expand it, take 17 and a half minutes, do just 2 of the passages very thoroughly and nail them, and then we just guess. Right, that is test taking strategy 101. You can't treat this like a normal test where you have to be perfect, right, or perfectionist. We don't have time for that. Just got to be better than the person next to you. ACT reading section, section 3, always in this order. Passage 1, literary narrative. This will be about characters, feelings, relationships, and so it is a passage that requires fewer notes and a more immersive reading style. So again, literary narrative, probably the one that you want to take the longest to read, which means maybe even though it's passage 1, you don't start with it. A lot of students benefit from not starting with literature. Maybe even we like the passage, but we find ourselves getting lost in the reading part and take too long. Versus passage 2, sciencey. So much more fact-based, lends itself to a quicker read and a hunt for clues. Passage 3, humanities, is kind of in between. And then passage 4 is sciencey again, a nice one to start with for a lot of people because it's very fact-based. It's just motor your way through, hunt for clues, and then answer the questions accordingly. It's an open book test, right? So you'll see 10 questions. You can go back and forth. The hope is that as you read, you make a little outline for yourself so you know where to go to find stuff. And some reading questions you can expect to see would be, what's the structure of the passage? Who's telling the story? What's the main idea of this passage or paragraph 6? And then lots of specific questions. As used in line 27, this word most nearly means what in context. And of the 4 passages, one of them will be a comparison passage. So it'll have passage A, passage B, and then some questions that relate to each and some that relate to both. The only difference here is don't read both passages at first. First read passage A and do the first few questions so you have less in your working memory, and then read passage B and do the rest. You never know which of the 4 passages will be comparison, right? So it's just a matter of treating it differently when you do see it. And the only other thing I want to mention on reading is it's all about thinking like these basement dwelling test writers who have to write test questions all day, every day. So our job as a test taker is think, all right, they wrote this question and a correct answer, but then 3 choices to fool us. So our job is really to find those bad answers. How do we do that? I mean, active reading is going to be huge. So active reading means pencil in hand. Passive reading is more like this, and then that becomes this, which can turn into that. That is dangerous. So pencil in hand, always moving, underlining, starring, circling, taking simple notes, not annotating. You do not have to go in order on reading. You can skip passages or just specific questions. Elimination by finding those words the test writers put in to make answers wrong. So don't go with the answer you like the most, go with your least hated answer. And then on reading, we like sparrows, not peacocks. Peacocks are flashy answers that say a whole lot and are specific. A sparrow is broad and vague, unassuming, just doesn't say much. That's a hard answer to argue with, which on reading is something we often like. Cool. Final section is science, and we'll just talk about the coming changes to the ACT and open it up for questions. The science section is the biggest crapshoot in that people sometimes feel really good about the material and like, oh, I learned this, but there's always going to be at least one or two things where you're like, man, this is confusing. Where did this come from? So understand that you can't really understand the science in this amount of time. We get less than a minute per question. So we have to move very quickly through all these passages and graphs. What that generally means is we don't have time to read the passage and we don't usually need it. So how to demystify this section, make it a little bit less intimidating? Number one is, and most important, stay on the surface. I go straight to the questions here, maybe skim the passage and graphs at most, but pretty much skip straight to the questions on science. And then match the words in the question and the answer choices to the graphs. A lot of times that's all you need, right? So if you read the question, the choices, and the graph that they allude to, you're probably done. If there is no match, then you need to look at the passage. And then at that point, it's like, okay, I got to skip this question. If there's still no match, use common sense, think like a scientist, pick something and move on. Get as many easy points as you can, though. And it doesn't matter what the actual topic is. It could be dirt, but here you can see a table with inverse and direct relationships between particle content and water content. It could be about clouds, where again here, just a relationship between whatever cosmic ray flux is and the cover percentage of low clouds. So our job as we read graphs is look for trends, be careful with the title and the axes and the columns and the rows, but think about if they asked you to infer something, what can we infer? And then the other stuff that's harder would be the scientific method. So asking actual science questions. How do these experiments differ? What was the independent variable? What was the control? Why did they do this? But they don't get to like rocket science. It's all, sixth grade science. Here's a practice question that I'll leave up for just a moment. Already seeing some good questions in the Q&A that we will definitely get to. This question's asking, at which of the following temperatures would the luminosity of a star and galaxy be, that's this line, be closest to 2 times the luminosity of a star and galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000? Well, at 3000, it looks like RL is 1. I'm guessing that must mean luminosity, but on the real test, I would go back to the passage to make sure, but RL is relative luminosity. It's at 1, so the question really is just when does it get to 2? Double that. And then we draw a line straight down, right? I'm on the B dash line. It looks like 3300. Our answer should be G, and it is. Matching on graphs, just matching answers and finding a point is a solid 20-30% of science questions. So even though this might seem simple, I guarantee you will get questions this easy. They'll just be mixed in with harder stuff. So it won't seem that obvious. Here's another one to look at. This is a relationships question. And this question is easy. As the surface temperature, x-axis, increases as we go from left to right, the average size, y-axis, only goes up. It's not a constant rate, but it never plateaus, it never goes down. It's B. And again, there are plenty of science questions that are that simple, others that require a little bit more thought and effort. But if you're careful on ACT and you read every question carefully and solve for the right thing, it's honestly half the battle. Of these 6 science passages, one will be different. So just be aware that one of the 6 passages is basically a reading passage. If you see like scientist 1, scientist 2, scientist 3, and not many graphs, treat it differently. And just what we do for that is we actively read and then we eliminate answers, just as if it were a reading section 3 passage. But for the normal science passages, the other 5, read the question, straight to the question and answer choices. Can't emphasize that enough. The answer choices are golden. Match those to the graphs. And then if there is no match, we need the passage. And then if there's still no match, you got to keep moving. So just use common sense, pick an answer, and move on. One of the hardest parts about section 4, besides the fast pace, is the mental stamina aspect. People are just tired because we've been there for a long time at that point. That's partially why they're making it optional. And so everything we've talked about is valid. And this applies to the ACT in April, in June, and July. But in September, so this middle box here, in September, the ACT is just straight up changing to a different test. We'll talk about how that change looks, but just understand that for a vast majority of us in the US, that's the timeline to look at. September of this year, the ACT will become a new shorter test. Science will become optional, so it's no longer part of the 36. It's an optional separate section. And it will still be a paper test. They're going to start to add more digital computer-based options, hopefully, but it's still a paper test. It's just going to be shorter. A lot shorter. So you can see here, with science, it's 5 minutes shorter, but science is going to be optional. So like this section right here, optional. They're shortening English by 10 minutes and 25 questions. Math, instead of 60 minutes for 60 questions, will be 50 minutes for 45 questions. Reading and science still pretty fast paced, but even reading, you can see there, 36 questions and 5 more minutes. So 4 fewer questions, but more time to accomplish, to finish that. So that's a great change, right? It's not only becoming a shorter test, but you get more time per question. And you can see anywhere from about 10 to about 30% increase in time per question from the current version to the version that we're going to see in September. Right? So much more time on average per question, which we love. So science, I mean, most of us just aren't going to take it. It remains to be seen exactly how colleges will handle this, but it's optional. You have to pay $4 to take it. So another little money grab for ACT. It's less fast paced. The reason to take it will be if you're like STEM and you want to go into math or engineering or some sort of science, and you're applying to, the Georgia Techs of the world. It will be scored as a standalone out of 36, and some schools may want to see it, or you may want to just show off your science chops. But it's a brand new thing. We'll know more about that in the coming months. But it's a huge change, right? So they're just going to average English, math, and reading. That's your new composite ACT score. Finally, just a few other little changes. So the English passages, instead of all being long, you'll have a few short ones as well. No more 5 answer choices. It'll only be 4 on math. And everything's just a little bit less advanced, so a little bit simpler generally, fewer calculus-y type questions. On reading, more diverse perspectives, and the length will vary. So some new shorter passages, probably with fewer questions attached. And in the science, I mean, because it's optional and only really targeted now towards STEM folks, it'll be a little bit more sciencey, so more outside knowledge, and there'll be at least one passage about engineering and design, which is a cool new change. There are, this is the only other thing, this is not very important, but the test information release that you can get with a few different ACTs. So if you take the official ACT in February, September, or December, you can get a full answer key back, test booklet. That's a great resource. So if you do find yourself taking those tests, and again, that's September, December, and February, make sure you go in and order the My Answer Key. Essay, so like the ACT doesn't really have an essay. This is the list of the schools requiring it as of a few years ago. And I'd really only ever heard of West Point. So there is an essay, a writing portion on ACT, but I haven't had to recommend for a student to take it in quite some time. Colleges are looking more at personal statements and other essays, not the ACT writing portion. Right? Are there some schools that still recommend it? Sure. And if you notice that, then maybe you want to take it. But like I said, I used to have to tell people take the essay at the end. And I haven't had to recommend that for years. So a few common questions, and then we'll get into your questions. When should I begin prepping? So towards the end of junior year is usually a good time. If you're super high scoring and you're looking at PSAT, right, and SAT along with ACT, maybe after sophomore year, summer before junior year, would be about the earliest I'd do it. Students and parents often say, like, what's a good score, which is impossible to answer. Depends on where you are and your goals and where you want to go to school. I will say that the average ACT, like 50th percentile nationally, is probably about a 21 out of 36. But most people don't feel good unless they get into like the high 20s. And then as far as test results and college apps, many colleges, if not most, super score, meaning they only see the highest section scores across multiple tests you take. So it definitely benefits you to take the official test more than once, ideally 3 times. And then depending on their policy, send what makes you look good, right? So you don't have to send all your test results. There's only like a few schools, literally like a few IVs, that make you send every test you've ever taken. And so as you decide on like where your score is and should I apply, you kind of look like here, Kennesaw, if I get a 23, I know that that's in the range 21 to 24. So if it's a test optional school, I would decide to submit my ACT score, right? Whereas if I was a little bit below that range, maybe I'd say, oh, this doesn't help my application. There's no wrong time to test, but again, 3 official tests is really right. You don't want to try to be one and done. Too much pressure and rarely works. So all 3 your junior year or 2 junior year, 1 summer before senior year, you can take ACT up until like September and still get it on early action deadlines. And then for regular college apps, October and December are both fine options too. No college has a preference. So prep to your strength, because no college prefers ACT over SAT or SAT over ACT. And finally, this test doesn't define you like even more than other tests, right? Like you don't have to be perfect. It's all on a curve. Think about how many other people are taking this test. That should kind of lessen your nerves. It's just a test of effort, not intelligence. If you work hard to understand what to expect, you'll do great. You'll succeed. You can improve, right? So it is just a matter of repetition and effort. But again, like even if you don't do great on the ACT, the worst thing that can happen is not that bad. So that's just my kind of final point. If you or your students interested in test prep or tutoring, reach out to Appleruth at this phone number. I'll provide the email as well. And we've got plenty of time. So I've seen a few questions come in. If you don't have any and you're satisfied, feel free to call it an evening. Thank you for joining. But yeah, I'm just going to open up the questions and kind of start leafing through those. So the first question is actually one I'm not totally sure how to answer. It's if I already took the PSAT, so like the pre-ACT in my school, should I take it again? I'm assuming that's referring to like taking a practice test. And like my initial gut reaction is yes, it depends on what grade you're in, but more practice is better because ACT not only being in the testing environment helps you understand it, but any test you take, you get results, right? You can work through those on your own or with a tutor. Like in my first meeting with a student, I would always pull up our most recent practice test. Let's go over the questions we missed and learn from them. The next question is about pacing. How do I keep a good steady pace throughout the test? That's quite hard to do. I can say all day, like, well, you just gotta skip questions when they're super tough. That is the true thing, but it's easier said than done. So I would say Pacing is all about practice. You have to time yourself. You have to sit down, maybe with your, smartphone, stopwatch, lap function, and see where you lose time. But my, I guess, short advice for keeping pace is do not dwell on every single question. If it's proving difficult to you, you're probably not the only one who feels that way. You should move past it. So it's going to be counterintuitive, but it is better to get a question wrong in 30 seconds than it is to get it right in like 2 or 3 minutes. Other than that, it's all just about practice. Practice makes perfect. See what you can get to, and then kind of know your limits. Next question is, can you get as good a score on the math section by doing well on the first half and guessing on the last ones? Because let's see, by rushing and getting to the harder questions. So basically the question is, can I still do well if I don't know the harder math topics that well? The answer is yes, like absolutely yes. The last 10 or 15 questions are often insane. Questions 45 through 60 on math are often incredibly hard. And so prioritize the first 30 or 40. And if you have to guess on 15 or 20 questions, absolutely you can still get a very good score. If you're aiming for like perfect 36, we probably can't do that. But you can get a score in the 30s and guess on a bunch of questions that you don't even get to. So yes, that's part of the strategy. Next question is, if you have testing accommodations at school, can you get those accommodations at the ACT as well? Yes, but you have to apply. And for the ACT, for every like test registration, you actually have to apply. So like if you're taking in April, you got to apply for your accommodations. And then again, if you're taking it in June. If you do have a 504 plan or IEP or extra time in school, the ACT generally does grant the time and a half accommodations, but work with your college counselor and make sure you get that application in, because you do have to apply. They won't give them to you automatically. Next is, will a timer be visible? The answer is no. Certain proctors might have like a digital clock up, but I wouldn't count on them. So there are like special ACT watches, which are basically watches that don't make noise. If you find yourself kind of always thinking about that or like needing to see it, make sure you bring a watch to test day. That's a good point. Because sometimes proctors will only announce, hey, 5 minutes left, right? You can't rely on them. Dangerous. Next question, what if you haven't taken the higher level math like pre-calc or trig? Trig is important, so I would say you can probably brush up on basic trig, and you need to before the ACT. Pre-calc doesn't come up very often. So if you've got algebra 2 under your belt, you're probably okay. But you definitely want to have algebra 2 done. And then, yeah, I mean, if you're aiming for like perfect math, we need some pre-calc stuff and higher level unit circle. But for most people, and for most questions, you don't need that. It's highly focused on algebra, arithmetic, and geometry. All right, some more good questions. What are the best resources I can use to prepare for the ACT? I'm biased, but Appleruth has a really, really good book. I don't have it right here, but it's you can get it like separate from tutoring. You can order it, and it breaks down all the topics. It has 2 full tests. There's what's called like the real ACT guide or the big book or something. So it's like 5 official ACT practice tests. There aren't that many great resources for ACT. And I assume they will release more digital and short practice with the new test, but it's the Appleruth guide, and it's practicing on your own with real tests and then learning from those. Next 2 questions are related, which is, what's the curve? Like how many questions can you get wrong in a given section to score a 34 or 35? The curve changes from test to test, but there's not like one test that has a stronger or weaker curve. It depends. There's like a scoring table. And so usually if you miss, 2 questions on science, that would go from a 36 to like a 34. But if it's a really hard test, maybe you miss 2 and it's a 35. I do think approximately in that range, though, to get a 34 out of 36, you can't miss more than a few questions, right? But I bet you could get like 55 out of 60 math questions correct and still receive a 34. How many times can you take the ACT if you're a junior right now? There's no limit. And I will say most students reach their full potential by 3. So after that, maybe diminishing returns. But you can take as many times as you want. I would plan for 3. Yeah, there's no limit. Someone asked about a good watch brand. If you Google like ACT watch, it's fairly cheap. I think it's like 20 bucks or something. It's silly, but uh, that there's just an ACT special watch. And the slides, I believe, get sent out on Friday to those people who registered. So you should receive the slides later this week. Got time for a few more questions. Let me just see what we've got here. If students have been taking the digital ACT, how different will it be for the paper, or sorry, digital ACT? How different will it be for the paper version? Same question if they use Desmos. So Desmos is for the digital SAT. Not many people have been taking the digital ACT, to be honest. Um, so the difference between digital ACT as it is right now in the paper is just that one's on paper and one isn't. But the biggest difference would be if you're not on a computer, then you have pencil in hand marking up the passages, uh, like really just, I'd say, especially on reading, taking notes, underlining, circling, marking through stuff. So that's the big difference. And there's little things like, do I do question one and then bubble it in, and question two and bubble it in? Or should I do the first 10 and then bubble those in? And that's more a matter of preference. Then is the essay question submitted separately? If you don't do well, do you have to submit? It's been a while. The essay is definitely separate. It's not graded out of 36. It's just like a separate score. And I believe you can like say if you decide, hey, I didn't like this writing portion, which is after section 4, I believe you can avoid it, but don't take my word for that. I would double check on the ACT website. So the question is like, if you don't do well in the essay, do you have to submit it? And I'm not certain about that. Next question, any tips for those in 10th grade, so sophomores, doing ACT practice tests? Since you probably haven't learned all the content for these tests and some of our audience is international. Yes, okay, so my tip for the practice ACT is, first off, remember it's usually simple. If you start to find your mind just like overanalyzing, don't do that. Usually a simple answer, but also recognize that you're going to miss questions and that's okay, right? So like learn from them, understand this practice test is not a real test and you're just aiming to, see what's on it. And then no matter what, how many mistakes you make, if you go back through it afterwards and learn from that, it's crucial. It'll also tell you what you need to improve on. So I would say just the main tip is keep it simple and then don't sweat the fact that you don't know everything. Prioritize the easiest questions. All right, I see two more questions. Number one, English is my second language, so I'm not strong in that aspect. I'm not a fast reader because this has happened to me in the past too. I grew up speaking Hebrew, and so it's easy to like flip back and forth. So if you're flipping language or you're finding yourself just reading and then realizing, I don't know what I just read, and you read it again, um, when that happens, you have to kind of force yourself to skip forward. So for students with English as a second language, I would focus on answer choices and patterns, and most of all, elimination. So ignore the context that you don't understand, go with the basic, simple stuff that you do, and count on the ACT writers not hiding the ball. They try to be pretty straightforward. So if you can eliminate and say, well, I know this wasn't here or this word is wrong, then you can often get to the best answer without even proving it. Next is the changes to the new test are considerable. Do you recommend taking the old or new? I like if it was, I always treat my students like I don't have kids, but as if they were my kid or as if it was me. If I was deciding between ACT and SAT right now, and my scores were pretty even, I would go to SAT immediately because ACT is changing. It's not stable. If you haven't taken an ACT yet and you're like a sophomore, I probably wouldn't take this paper ACT. I'd probably wait till the shorter version. Um, Finally, I think the shorter test is going to be more fun, better, shorter. So I'm a little bit biased just because of what I've seen from ACT, and I don't know exactly how this new rollout will, go. But I'd be steering most students towards SAT because it's more stable, And then if you are taking ACT, as long as you're not like already nearing college app time, I'd probably take the new test, the new shorter version. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't take a pre-ACT. So the question is, should I not take it if I'm a sophomore? I mean, the content's going to overlap so much that like it will still help to take a practice. The question is about like an official test, right? So no, taking a practice or pre-ACT is a great idea, just like an SAT is, because it'll give you baseline knowledge of what you need to work on. Really good questions. This will be our last one. And thank you so much for the good questions for joining tonight. Final question is, when do you decide to share your score? Before you take it or later when you start applying? And the answer is later. Some colleges are test optional. When you apply to a college, then you have the option to send certain scores. You get to choose for most colleges. And so usually that's when you're submitting is when you start applying. And sometimes like you can even, if you take a test score during applications and it's better than your previous, you can just supplement your applications with that. But no, there's no pressure to decide to send it while you're taking the test, right? We want to figure out where we're at and then go from there. All right, a lot of questions, good ones. Thank you so much for joining. Hope it was helpful. Good luck with ACT and beyond, and have a great evening.